address a specific problem, the value of the public to the public of the regulation. B, the impact of the regulation on the problem or the benefits provided by it. C, the adverse impact, if any, the regulation has had on various groups, including but not limited to businesses of various sizes, small communities, and government entities. D, the cost of the regulation, including but not limited to the cost of enactment and enforcement. E, whether the regulation remains necessary. F, whether alternate forms of regulation may adequately address the problem. G, whether regulation is written clearly and concisely as to achieve easy understanding and application. And H, whether any regulation addresses the same problems. 3, upon completion of its review, each regulatory body shall identify, consistent with my regulatory priorities and the assessments made, regulations that are no longer necessary. On December 31st, 2011, each regulatory body shall submit to this order, shall submit a report to my office detailing the findings of its assessment and proposals for regulations that may be repealed or modified. The following regulations are not subject to the freeze. A, regulations that affect public health. B, regulations that affect public safety and security. C, regulations that are necessary in the pursuit of federal funds and certifications. D, regulations that affect the application of powers, functions, and duties essential to the operation of the state agency, department, board, or commission at issue. E, regulations that affect pending judicial deadlines. And F, regulations necessary to comply with federal law. 5, within 90 days of the date of this order, each regulatory body subject to this order that intends to continue with the enactment of a proposed regulation under an exception to the freeze shall submit a report to my office detailing the problem the regulation addresses or the value to the public of the regulation, how the regulation addresses the problem or the benefits provided by the regulation, why alternate forms of regulation are insufficient to address the problem, whether other regulations currently address the problem, and how the current regulation falls within one of the exceptions. So what I would like to have the board consider here, I think this regulation falls within exception. D, regulation that affect the application of powers, functions, and duties essential to the operation of the state agency, department, board, or commission at issue. And the reason I say that is because this was written by our Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General, to clear up existing regulation. And even the department, when Patrick Cates wrote a review of all of these heritage projects, he stated, projects were evaluated for compliance with NRS 501-2575, NAC 501-300, and NAC 501-320. And it says, no project met all application criteria, including NAC 501-300. And he further said, most of the projects did not meet all of the priorities for the Heritage Program as specified in NAC 51320. Conclusions. It may be appropriate to consider revamping the process for submission and selection of heritage projects. NAC 51300 should be reviewed and perhaps revisited to better reflect the purpose of the program and defined in NRS and take into account the broad array of projects it allows. So even the department says the regulation should be rewritten to clarify. And we spent thousands and thousands of dollars, potentially up to $100,000 was for some money on a lawsuit that was filed. And the lawsuit was filed, this is truly about process, following the rules and regulations. So what our Attorney General was trying to do is improve the rules and regulations for one, the public, and for two, the department, and three, the commission could follow to make sure within the law. And so it's a cleanup regulation that's needed. It's not a new regulation, and I think the purpose of the executive order was if it hurts businesses, and this is not going to hurt any business. So I've got two motions, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make. One is I'd like to make a motion that we don't vote on this today, and my second motion, I don't know if I can do motion at the same time. I'll tell you what it's going to be. that we address, that we have a constituency of you, the chairman, and Commissioner Capurro, take these concerns and meet with the governor and tell him that this should fall under his exceptions. And I'll do the first motion first, that, and barring the letter from the governor, excuse me.
Please.
I think that we should not vote on it and try to explain it to the governor, because I'm not sure he really understands what we're trying to do. Even the department says it needs to be cleaned up.
All right. If I could, before we get to there, one thing is, it's been fairly well, I think, stated by this commission that we're not going to take any action at this point to go ahead and approve this. However, we need a public comment, and I'd ask, we're really run tight on schedule, so please be as brief as you possibly can. Public comment. Go ahead.
For the record, Paul Dixon speaking as a private citizen. I would like to request here under Freedom of Information Act, Chairman Lynn has made several things about spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to defend the lawsuit that I filed personally against this commission for their not following the NAC rules related to the Heritage Project process. I know what it cost me personally to do this, and I can guarantee you I don't have pockets at $100,000, and if you spend $100,000, I'd like to understand that, but I'd like to see proof of what we spent in public funds for this and put it on the record so that once and for all we can say this is how much it costs the sportsmen of Nevada, and not just say roughly or other things. Okay. And the other part I'd like to add to this is your point of this is housekeeping. It was brought up in court by the Deputy Attorney General that in order to not have lawsuits in the future, that if you soften this language that's in the Heritage and allowed things, if you made it so that you didn't have the shalls and the wills, that you would be able to have a lot more room for discretion as a commission. And I believe that all these changes are to allow this commission to have greater discretion, and the NACs were written in a fashion to hold accountable what was being done here, and I would like to see no changes. And I will say that when this was put on the agenda in December, for the December commission meeting, every cab that I read supported not making any changes to these things. You put it back on here again, and most of the cabs did not respond to this based on the governor's letter. But I can guarantee you, if you look at the record from December, almost every cab that I read, I can't say 100%, but every cab that I looked at, and that was a majority of them, and I communicate with all of them, were against any changes here. So back to the point of your public is telling you it shouldn't be changed, and the only thing you don't want to be held to is accountable for how you do your business up there. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further public comment? Seeing none, move back to the commission. Well, okay, we have two. We have Mr. Capurro, Mr. Howell, and then hopefully we can get. We have a, then we'll be looking for a second on this motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We go back to the situation that this was what.
Can't hear you.
Most of the language that is in here was recommended to us by the Deputy Attorney General Brian Stockton. And other things came up with respect to, again, the conclusions that you read into the record from Mr. Cates, who did a very extensive review of all of the projects that were subject to this and made some conclusions that there needed to be some changes. That's what we're dealing with here. There's some inappropriate language in here that is difficult for any project to meet specifically. So the intent was to try to make sure that it is understandable in the King's English for anyone who might be applying for these funds, whether it be a private organization or the Department of Wildlife itself. So from that standpoint, it is cleanup. It pretty much covers those areas that were told to us by our Deputy Attorney General that we needed to take a look at in order to prevent some of the questions that came up with respect to the lawsuit that was filed. And that's the reason for it sitting in front of you now.
All right, we had a motion that was made before I rudely interrupted the motion that was made. And that motion was to table, will you please restate that first motion?
The motion was to not take a vote on this agenda item. That was the first motion I had, and the other motion was to, on a delegation, to go visit the governor.
Okay.
But we should do them separately.
Okay, there was a motion to not take action on this item. Okay, it's been properly moved and seconded to not take action on this item. We had a comment on that by Mr. Howell.
Shouldn't we table it until March?
Not take action, table. You could,
We're going to have a chance to confer with the governor between now and March, I would assume.
all I'm doing is processing the motion, which was not take action today.
I'd like to put that amendment in that we table it until March. So
Mr. Howell would like to ask the maker of the motion to, if he would consider revising his motion, make it table the motion until March.
I think, why don't we get a second to the,
There was a second on your motion.
no, a second to the amendment, and then vote on the amendment
Okay,
first.
so that was an amendment. You'd like to amend, we have a motion to amend the main motion to table the item until March. Listening? That was seconded. Okay. Now, the current amendment to the motion, so we're just voting on the amendment. The amendment is to change the main motion to state, we're tabling this item until March.
I'd just like to.
Go ahead.
Chairman, Mr. Chairman, I just didn't put that in the motion mainly because it's a legislative year, and what if you don't confer the governor by then? And I think that as soon as you do, then we could put it back on the agenda instead of being specific till March. I mean, what if you don't have an answer by March? Then we're obligated to bring it back in March, but that's why
Okay.
I thought that I wouldn't. put on the
Okay.
amendment.
Excellent explanation, Mr. Capurro.
Chairman, it also, though, by putting it in for the March meeting, kind of. It kind of necessitates us pushing for that meeting with the governor to get an answer. And that's why I'm supporting that, revision to it. And
Okay.
it just seems to me like you could always take it off the agenda if you're within the period of time that allows for it under open meeting law before then.
Okay, so we're having a vote on the motion to change the main motion to table the item until March. Everybody understand the motion? That is to amend. All in favor of the motion to amend, signify by raising your hand. We've got 3 in favor, all opposed. And we have,
Abstain.
okay. We've got three in favor, which are Mr. Capurro, Mr. Howell, Mr. Schrum in favor, and we have Mr. Calvin, Mr. Lent, and Mr. Vogler opposed, and, wow, and we have 2 abstentions, Mr. Wallace, Mr. Macbeth. Wow. I vote nay on the motion. So motion to amend fails. Let's go back. We have the main motion, which is to bring this to restate the main motion as it was, because we've muddied the waters a little bit.
The second motion was.
Or the first motion. We're back to the first motion.
First motion was not to vote on this item.
Okay. First motion was not.
Period.
First motion, the motion on the table now is not to vote on this item at this time. So, all in favor of the motion not to vote on the motion, signify. Vote by raising your hand.
Aye.
Okay.
2
All
abstained.
opposed?
They abstained.
Abstentions? Do not vote?
Abstain.
Abstain.
So there's people that voted, okay. We had 2 abstentions?
State-
Yes. Everybody else voted not to vote,
You got to state your reason.
except I didn't vote.
Abstained it.
So the motion that is to not vote on this item today passes. And now second motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we send a delegation comprising of Chairman Rain and Commissioner Capurro to meet with the governor and explaining our concerns, explain everything to him to see if he would, if this falls under was his exemptions to the executive order. Exceptions to the executive order.
Okay, it's been properly moved and seconded. Seconded by Commissioner Shrum to send delegation, 2 people comprising of Chairman and Mr. Capurro, Chairman of the Legislative Committee, to meet with Governor on this issue. Does everybody understand that motion? All in favor of that motion signify by stating aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, motion passes 8-0.
No, it didn't.
Oh, was there some abstentions?
Abstain.
Abstain.
We have 2 okay, motion passes. Somewhat confusing sometimes. I usually don't ask for abstentions. Okay, so we had 6 in favor and the same 2 abstentions. Mr. Shrum. So we voted, didn't take any action other than to not take action. And talk about it later. Okay, the next item, hopefully it could go pretty quick because basically this next item is, my understanding, number 14, is we're talking about a draft of a draft. The B is already stricken from that. We have,
You didn't do 9, did you?
but those were put to the end. Those were put to the end of the agenda. So number 14, Mr. Stremler is not present. Mr. Vogler was going to present this item. I believe the committee, I was present at that, they sent forward some paperwork for consideration of the commission, and they were looking for suggestions from the commission on these items. And could you explain kind of what happened at the committee meeting, Mr. Vogler?
We had a phone hookup with Reno, and we had a full audience pretty much at Eureka. We kind of roughed out some things with the help of Mr. Elmer Bull of what we thought should be the Feral Horse Committee policy. And again, these are suggestions that further scrutiny we expect here. I'll read that if you'd like. It's a policy for the Nevada Department of Wildlife on wild and free-roaming horses and burros and the effect on rangeland water resources. The creation of...
Excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt. I apologize. But this policy, I don't see it on the agenda. And
this is a report, well, it's part of a committee report. This is part of his committee report. We can't vote on this item because this is the committee report and recommendation. Let's see. Report from Feral Horse Committee, first item, and then it goes on about the other letters. So this is kind of a general report from the Feral Horse Committee. That was something that was brought up. Of course, we can't vote on that item or anything because it's part of their report. So if any action to be taken on that would, of course, be a future meeting. Continue with your report.
Again, this is just a draft of some of the things that we thought that should be in the policy based on the fact that Wild and Free-Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971 covers everything that needs to be covered, and giving them a further definition seemed moot and far beyond what the Nevada Department of Wildlife's intentions should be. So anyhow, the second paragraph reads, where the Board of Wildlife Commissioners finds there is a conflict between wildlife in Nevada and the federal government Wild and Free Roaming Horse and Burro Act, the board will direct the BLM or other government agencies to strictly comply with the Wild and Free Roaming Horse and Burro Act and maintain thriving ecological balance. Furthermore, there is no beneficial use of Nevada water as wildlife for federally protected horses and burros. Any use of water by wild and free-roaming horses and burros protected under the 1971 Act will be considered unlawful and will be opposed by the board. In accordance with Section 1333 of the Act of 1971, management of wild horses will include consultation and coordination for the purpose of analysis of thriving ecological balance and addressing issues of water use and conflict between wild and free-roaming horses and burros and wildlife. That was the policy statement. I would also like to read into the record a draft, like, once again, needs approval, but this is what we came up with as a letter, or a draft of a letter, or a start of a letter, however you want to refer to Mr. King, who has, as of this time, issued a permit to wild horses as wildlife. Not as wild and free-roaming horses, but as wildlife. It has come to the attention of the Nevada Board of Wildlife Commissioners that federally protected horses and burros are using waters of the state of Nevada for which they have no legal beneficial use designation. These animals are classified as free and wild roaming horses and burros by the Wild Horse and Burro Act, and the federal agencies insist that they are neither wildlife nor domestic livestock. As discussed below, Nevada law classifies all equine species, horses and burros, as livestock, and dearly does not classify any equine species as wildlife, and will not do so in the immediate future. The Commission agrees with previous classification of beneficial use of Nevada water that includes private lawful designations for beneficial use of water, such as livestock, irrigation, wildlife, and wildlife habitat. The Commission has found that joint use of the same water sources by livestock and wildlife has been proven beneficial to both throughout Nevada. The Commission also agrees that any state engineer denial of water rights in the name of the U.S. government or its agencies is consistent with Nevada water law insomuch as the U.S. government's agency do not own wildlife or livestock or irrigated croplands that represent current classifications of beneficial use of water. Please be advised that the Nevada Wildlife Commission has been unable to identify the state law which justifies any federal agency to attain a water right for a special status equine species as wildlife. Given this and the discussion below, please include the following items as policy and future action of the Division of Water Resources. Notify each federal agency that is harboring free and wild roaming horses and burros that the continued use of water for which there is no designated beneficial use is in violation of Nevada law. 2, notify each federal agency that the known incidents of wild horses and burros causing degraded water quality, often complete loss of a spring or seep, discharge, and interference with the use of that water by Nevada wildlife is in violation of Nevada law. 3, instruct the federal agencies to immediately remove any wild and free-roaming horses that are making unlawful use of Nevada waters. Title 45 of the Nevada Revised Statutes includes the following definition that identifies wild animals as those found naturally in a wild state which cannot possibly apply to horses. In Nevada's NRS 501.087, wildlife defined. Wildlife means any wild animal, wild bird, fish, reptile, amphibian, mollusk, or crustacean found naturally in a wild state, whether indigenous to Nevada or not, and whether raised in captivity or not. Other statutes, NRS 1969, 1330, 1330A, 1987, 560, 1991, 259, 2007, 1798. Nevada legislatures explain why They have carefully defined what is and what is not wildlife in Title 45 NRS 501.100, Legislative Declaration regarding wildlife. 1, wildlife in this state not domesticated and its natural habitat is part of the natural resources belonging to the people of the state of Nevada. The preservation, protection, management, and restoration of wildlife within the state contributed measurably to the aesthetic, recreational, and economic aspects of these natural resources. This leads to the conclusion that there is no beneficial use of water for federal government's Mustangs, wild horses, or feral horses, depending on how you label them. Furthermore, neither the Nevada Department of Wildlife nor the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service claim that these animals are wildlife, and under their jurisdiction, the waters within most of the Nevada rangeland wildlife habitats that are grazed by domestic animals are owned by the rancher and shared by law and cooperation with Nevada's wildlife. The federal government has no law that supersedes the state of Nevada's water law in accordance with the 10th Amendment. Conclusion, the timing of the arrival of the horses and burros as domestic animals in the Great Basin is well documented, which is why they have often been referred to as feral animals. In turn, the claim of federal ownership of these animals dates to the Act of 1971 and does the removal of the horses and burros from classification as either wildlife or domestic livestock. Failure of federal agencies to properly and humanely manage these animals is also well documented, as is the risk to resident wildlife from wild and free-roaming horses and burros. The Nevada Board of Wildlife Commission would strenuously object to any attempt to assign a form of beneficial use of Nevada water for these federally owned animals, and we find that it would be entirely appropriate for the state of Nevada to instruct the federal agencies to remove any federal animals that are using water in violation of Nevada law. The Commission welcomes an opportunity to work with the state engineer and the experts within the State Division of Water Resources concerning this issue. Also, I have a letter that was written to Jason King from the Department of Agriculture. If it would please you, I would like to read it into the record. It says, Dear Mr. King, it has come to the attention of the Nevada Department of Agriculture and the Board of Agriculture that water sources are being designated by the state engineer specifically for use by federally protected wild and free-roaming horses and burros. Based on applications submitted by the Bureau of Land Management, it has been well established by the federal agency that animals so designated as wild and free-roaming horses and burros are neither wildlife or domestic livestock. Apparently, the issuance of these permits is based on the assumption by the state engineer that these animals are in wildlife. Wild and free-roaming horses and burros have not had a notable shortage of water over the years, as evidenced by their continued growth in numbers. Obviously, their needs have been well met by not only the natural seeps, springs, creeks, and rivers that exist in Nevada, but also the multitude of livestock waters developed by both industry and the agencies. The department and the board finds that specific use of Nevada water by federally protected wild and free-roaming horses and burros is in direct conflict with the Nevada Board of Agriculture Water Policy Statement dated June 19, 2009. In accordance with that policy, the Board of Agriculture notes that beneficial use of Nevada water includes such lawful designations as livestock, irrigation, wildlife, and wildlife habitat. We do not find that the permits to use Nevada's water specifically for wild and free-roaming horses and burro designated as wildlife by the state engineer to be a legal use of such waters. The seriousness of this situation is being compounded by the fact that the agencies are now requesting that when a permit is issued for an underground source of livestock water requiring pumping, that the permittee must continue to pump water even when livestock are absent, specifically for the beneficial use of wild and free-roaming horses and burros. in order for both the department and board to have a more thorough understanding of the position of the state engineer, we would very much like to have you make a presentation on this matter at our next board meeting scheduled March 8, 2011. On behalf of the department and board, I look forward to your response to this invitation. And it's carbon copied to Mike Stremler, John DeLong, and the Board of Agriculture.
Excellent.
I guess the upside or downside, that's the conclusions that we came to based on the material that was presented and the discussions had. This is a very contentious issue, as we all know. Won't be easy. It affects a good deal of people, especially in the light of Las Vegas's desire to build a pipeline into White Pine County. And there are water issues that have to do with wildlife there, and this will not go away easily, but designating wild horses as wildlife is a real slippery slope, especially when the 1971 Wildlife or Wild Horse and Burro Act did not include that in it. So I'm sure it won't take much discussion.
All right, we're
Thank
running really short on time. One thing, on paragraph 3 of the policy draft, third paragraph, last sentence, there was appeared to me to be an omission from my notes, and it'd be really good to fix that omission, because this would make it really contentious the way it is, where it says any use of water. I believe it was any use of water as wildlife. As wildlife was part of that statement by wild and free roaming horses. So we need to make sure we jot that down, because otherwise it sounds like you're opposed to them drinking any water. And that's not what the committee was saying. They were saying water as wildlife. Right. So insert those words. That I noticed that omission from my notes was any use of water as wildlife by wild and free roaming horses. And in interest of time in this commission, this is going to go back to the committee. That would probably be the best place and time to go ahead and hash over this. When they're going to have another committee meeting. Mostly they said, yeah, we want to throw out an FYI to everybody. This is out there, so when we have our next committee meeting, the commission's seen it, the public's seen it, they've had a few weeks to digest it before they make a final draft. So really, if we have any comments or suggestions, that would probably be the appropriate time, especially considering our time constraints. Okay, I want to throw this out. Public, we're all going to have a committee meeting on this, and that'd really be the best time, but since it is basically an action item, we have to have public comment, and we need to do that right now before they toss us out of this building. So, yes. Okay, and remember that, the portion on that one paragraph I just stated, that change, that's very important. Otherwise, it misconstrues what the committee was wanting. Public comment, nothing once, nothing twice. We have one over in the corner. We also have some other correspondence here for the record. There was quite a lot of correspondence on the record. We got a lot of emails. Those have all been acknowledged. And these are several I'll hold on to and I'll give to Suzanne for the record here later. Lots of emails subject. Please go ahead. And the committee meeting, you'll have lots more time to talk about it as well.
All right. Well, I'll try to keep it to 3 or 4 minutes like everybody else. My name's Cindy MacDonald for the record. And the first thing I'd like to do is I have 2 questions. I'd like a little bit more clarity on this issue. The first is the reason you guys are having this discussion is because the Act authorizes you to consult with BLM regarding wild horses and burros. Is that correct? Is that your authority?
It's public comment. I mean, we don't have time
I'm asking for clarity. So you don't know? All right. The second question I have is, do you have any authority to directly manage or remove wild horses and burros under this commission that gives you the authority to discuss this issue? No comment?
This is not a question and answer period. Sorry.
I'm asking for my clarity. Everybody else has been able to ask questions and get answers today. All right. The first time I attended a wildlife commissioners meeting was in 2007, and I watched a bunch of commissioners laugh and joke between BLM about why wild horses and burros couldn't be slaughtered, and that if the public had a problem with that, they should start adopting. As a result of that, I received And I received a protest that Nevada Department of Wildlife filed against a BLM application for water for the Red Rock Wild Horses and Burros that basically used the same argument that the Feral Horse Committee is regurgitating today. Within that argument, they basically said that the proposed site failed to benefit Nevada's wildlife. And the reasons they cited were because bighorn sheep and mule deer were not located in the area. Therefore, the insects, reptiles, small mammals, bats, and birds that could have benefited from this water development were denied water. And I would like to point out that it was not Nevada's wild horses that caused Nevada's wildlife to go without a drink, but it was an NDOW. The second thing I'd like to do, I'm going to jump around. I just got 2 or 3 points to bring it to my nice summary. The second thing I'd like to point out is I have reviewed dozens and dozens of EAs over the last 4 or 5 years with NDOW constantly up BLM's neck, constantly trying to reduce and remove wild horses and burros. In my email files, I have an email from Russ Mason, chief of game chief, who basically counseled somebody that the appropriate management, the most appropriate management for wild horses and burros was what National Park Service did, and that was shoot them. So I'm trying to show a trend here. In 2004, Tony Waisley produced a thing called Mule Deer Dynamics, where Mule Deer Restoration Committee, I wanted to read the quote from Mule Deer Dynamics. It said that very little work has been conducted to examine the potential for competition between feral horses and mule deer. Despite recent concerns over wildlife habitat loss to feral horse use, horse numbers are still only a fraction of cattle numbers, and excluding localized incidences likely provide only a fraction of competition of cattle.
We're at the 3 minutes, ma'am.
I measured everybody. They got 4 or 5. I would like more time.
We need to wrap it up.
All right. Yes, I understand that. I tried to keep this short. The Mule Deer Restoration Committee adopted 2 things in November that basically are going to look for and to document the habitat destruction of feral horses. The Nevada Horse Committee is now looking to take water away from wild horses. I would like to remind the Commission that these are federally protected animals, and given the trend,
All right.
I would like to open the record for an investigation into Nevada Department of Wildlife for basically failing to comply with NRS 504-490
I'm sorry, we're
and
out-
CFR
we're way over 4 minutes
470.
Sorry.
I'm sure you are.
Got to be same for, go ahead, ma'am. Welcome.
For the record, I'm Arlene Gahn, a Las Vegas realtor and semi-retired wildlife photographer, primarily from Africa. In Africa, visitors do pay high prices to see zebra stallions fighting for dominance, lead herd females disciplining youngsters, or a herd stallion fending off unsuitable suitors for one of his daughters. They are considered wildlife over there, and they make a lot of money for each of the African countries that maintains the herds. Our wild Mustangs do that same behavior and more in the West. Having done wildlife safaris at every level, from rough to well-heeled, over 20 years on 3 continents, I can assure you that the thrill of seeing Mustangs and burros running wild in the magnificent West will attract people from all over the world. Here's their benefit. Americans will not have much success creating significant numbers of new manufacturing jobs, particularly in the rural west of Nevada. But we can easily develop our iconic physical and historical assets. Wild horses and burros could be the banner attraction, but ecotourists will stay to enjoy an area's local character, its food, cowboy poetry festivals, and historical sites. Restaurants, motels, B&Bs, tour guides, food suppliers, transportation companies will benefit, to mention but a few. Pipeline or energy construction, mining and ranching jobs are not enough to protect locals from boom-bust cycles, and those jobs don't promote America. Visitors do. They come, admire, and recommend the American West to others, and visitors keep coming decade after decade, an ongoing cash flow to our state and the nation. When a rural youngster can choose between managing a B&B on a father's land, guiding tourists, or working in town at restaurants and motels, life is vastly improved. Not fancy choices, some might say, but they can be great choices for most kids because they're hometown jobs near friends and relatives. A community college may start up. However, if rural youth must move to cities for jobs or education, they lose their community legacy while stripping those communities of their best and brightest. We have an extraordinary wilderness in America. Our Mustangs are the equivalent of Africa's zebras and elephants. Why can third world Africans save their wildlife on enormous tracts of wilderness, but we can't do the same for wild horses and burros? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you coming out. Public comment. We had you, ma'am? Yes. Please, come on up. Welcome. Then who's next? I guess that'll be it, looks like.
My name is Carmen Rhoda, and I see that you've deferred this to a committee meeting, this draft letter. Is that correct?
They will hear it again. Yeah, we will have this at
A
the
public
committee
meeting on this?
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
It'll
and
be a
what
committee
committee is
meeting.
this going to?
It'll be a committee of, it'll be the Feral Horse Committee of this commission, and then they'll bring it back to this commission
Okay, so
for
that's not
final.
open to the public.
Oh, it's all open. They're all
Okay, could I
open.
ask when that committee meeting is going to be?
It's not currently scheduled, but it's got to be scheduled more than a week in advance of our next commission, of the commission meeting, which we'll vote on it. At ndow.org, they'll be posted on at the website, and you can get that information from staff over here.
Okay, is it possible to get a copy of the draft letter that you have proposed currently?
Absolutely. Absolutely, right there on the counter next to you, and you could probably get on the email list to be
Okay, so
advised of that.
this will be open again to
Absolutely,
public?
all of our meetings are, and all of our committee meetings are.
Because I'm kind of appalled. I mean, I've been sitting here for 4.5 hours listening to people harangue on for half hour, 45 minutes, but yet when it comes to this issue, you've got 3 minutes. That's it.
Public comments, one
I
thing.
mean, is it
presentations
bias
are
showing
things.
by any chance? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you coming out. Okay, we have Mr. Dixon. Public comments, sir.
For the record, Paul Dixon, Chairman of Clark County CAB. One of the things that was discussed at our meeting, because there was a fair amount of correspondence, Paul Harris was here earlier from my CAB and had to leave. Mike Reese is here, and he could follow on, is that the wording that we have right now in the letter on water rights, I understand where you're going, where you guys would like to end up, but I think what we've ended up with language that is very strong, and I agree with you when you want to put the clarification in what you had there, Chairman Raines, but I'm not sure that that's strong enough. I think in the letters that I got personally on this issue, we have very much polarized people, and they're under the belief that you want to take away all rights of water of horses. And even with the change that you made there in calling that, I don't think it's clear to the vast majority of the people who read that letter and the press that's going to pick it up. And I would strongly recommend that the Feral Horse Committee, when it reconvenes and meets, works on some strategic wording and get somebody in there professional to help them write that such that it is clear to the public of where we want to control for ranchers and other things that water rights issue. Okay? Thank you.
Excellent. I'm sure they'd welcome any written submissions you have. And that was not my change, by the way. That was what I had from my notes from their meeting that they said. Public comment. Going once. Okay. Public hearing is closed on this item. Anything further from the commission? Go ahead, Mr. Macbeth.
I don't think this letter, and I realize we're going to move it to another meeting, but I want to go on record that I just don't think it's a good idea. In fact, I don't think there's a lot of good things going on. When I first got on this commission, and everybody knows this, one of my very first issues that I wanted to address was the issue of wild horses. I have been basically wanting to deal with this issue the entire 2.5 years plus now that I've been on this commission. And in fact, had pushed for a very long time to get a committee put in place to deal with wild horses. And so when I first saw that that had happened, I was happy. But then when I saw who was on the committee, I was disappointed. And this is what I mean, with all due respect. We, as a commission, have delegated this issue to the livestock industry, because every member on the committee is in the livestock industry. And I think that is a bad idea. It doesn't send the right message, and the committee is not balanced. It's not dealing with all of the issues that we have on wild horses, and they have selected one. And I almost, it almost looks like to me that we're going back to the Sagebrush Rebellion for the livestock industry. And so I just think it's a terrible idea and a terrible message that we're sending the way we're doing this. The second thing is, second matter is that the letter assumes that horses aren't wildlife, and I think that's a dangerous assumption to make. And first of all, the people that are writing this letter aren't attorneys, and they haven't consulted with attorneys, and this is an issue that I think is completely open as to whether it's wildlife. In fact, I want to point out that in NRS 504-430, at preservation of wild horses, right in our own chapters, that deal with wildlife under propagation, under management and propagation of wildlife, we've got specific NRS that deals with the preservation of wild horses. And so this is going to get shoved right down our throat. And so any assumption that these horses aren't wildlife, I think, is a bad idea. Furthermore, I don't think it makes any difference whether they're wildlife or not, because if you know and understand water law, it's going to be dealing with a scarce resource and how it's allocated amongst users, beneficial users. And when you get right down to the analysis, it's a public interest. We're going to get a balancing of all public interest with regard to these water resources, and it's going to include both horses and wildlife. And so the issue is complex. Willis Lamb sent a bunch of material with regard to Federal Reserve water rights. That's a whole hornet's nest. I personally have looked into that. I actually raised that issue at the last meeting, I actually even consulted one of Nevada's top water lawyers with regard to this issue, and he has his doubts whether there's a Federal Reserve water rights when the act was set up, but it hasn't ever been answered. I don't think the courts have answered that question, ultimately it really goes down to what did the legislature mean wildlife meant in the context of water law, not in the context of wildlife law, in the context of water law. Now, we can just sit there and assume that they look over to the NRS chapter that deals with wildlife and say, oh, yeah, but it's not over there, but we don't know. Nobody in this analysis and in this letter has done any kind of a search of the legislative history of when the water law basically reserved water rights for wildlife, what the definition of wildlife was. So, but I want to say that I think this is a very good issue to explore, and I think we should explore it. I think we should work with the Division of Water Resources on this. I just don't like the way we're doing it. I don't think we should be sending letters, basically that are going to be perceived to be coming from the livestock industry. And, on this issue, I think that it should be done through a collaboration of these two departments and it be handled in a much more behind-the-scenes, fashion until we can get our hands around this issue. This is just simply a bad way to do it. That is my biggest concern.
Thank you. There are two members in the committee that are not, that aren't ranchers. But anyways, that's another subject. I'm sure that they would be extremely happy to hear all those opinions, especially if you got any extra drafts or rewording. I'm sure, these are pretty open-minded people, and they'd be happy to hear about it, and they'll have a meeting, and we could probably have a teleconference down here at the Las Vegas office if possible.
Yes, Mr.
Yes,
Chairman.
go ahead, Mr. Vogler.
One of the real concerns is that it was identified a very long time ago that the Virginia range horses basically came from the ranchers in Washoe Valley. That when they didn't need them for haying in the wintertime, they would turn them out in the Virginia range. And it has, for whatever reason, the Nevada Department of Wildlife Department of Agriculture wound up with the care of these horses. 80% of the property is privately owned. These horses are crossing the highway. The liability is now with the Department of Agriculture if something goes wrong. And the BLM has basically walked away from the issue. So if it sounds like a preemptive strike, maybe it was, and maybe too much emphasis has been put on wildlife. But the 1971 Wild and Free Roaming Burro, Horse and Burro Act does not call them wildlife. And for us to call them wildlife, we may be opening ourselves up to liability across the state if somebody were to be hurt on the road. I don't know. These are the reasons that we drafted these letters. These are the reasons we have the subcommittee, and any input from anybody would be most welcome. Thank you.
And they have repeated that at the commission meeting, and that's why they didn't want to send a final draft to this commission right now. They wanted to make sure that there was ample time for all commissioners, especially, as well as all members of the public, had more than ample time to weigh in on the matter. And in all sincerity, to Curtis and Mr. Macbeth and whatnot, they will listen to you. These are people that sincerely will listen, and I mean, they really will listen to your advice. And that'd be great. Give them a call. Before we recess for the evening, we had Mr. Capurro.
Yes, sir. Just a couple of real quick housekeeping things. In the first place, the Virginia herd is not under the Free and Wild Roaming Horse Act and Burro Act. They are state. They're wards of the state, basically, and are considered feral horses. So there's a difference. Most people look at them and say that's a wild horse, but that is the difference, and that's what causes us some of these problems. And that I would suggest to you, if I'm not able to meet that, I'd like to suggest that you consider that wherever you've used it kind of interchangeably, but if you're going to say livestock in one place and domestic livestock in another, it ought to be consistent, and therefore throughout, seems to me like domestic livestock should be used. The other thing is that on page 3, where it says legislative declaration regarding wildlife, that should be legislative declaration of intent regarding wildlife. And lastly, I would agree with you that does need to be cleared up on the last page about the fact that you are not trying to deny them. You are trying to clarify that they are not classified either by the feds or by the state as wildlife.
Okay. Anything else from the commission before we adjourn for the not adjourn? We have a recess for the evening. Okay. Go ahead. We're public comments over, so. One more redress? Let's see, 9 and 10 we put at the end, so we'll start with 15 in the morning, continue on through, and then 9 and 10 are at the end. That's what our motion was. Yeah, end of tomorrow. So, that said, we stand in recess till 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Yes. Oh.
That's on the agenda, 8:30. You gonna hold us to that? What are you doing? Huh? You gonna hold us to that?
Yeah, 8:30. 8:30 for the record, 8:30, adjourn.